Jacob, you know this is not your house.
Yes, but if I go, you don't go back. So what's the problem? What are you yelling at me? I didn't do this. I didn't do this.
But
It's easy to yell at me, but I didn't do this.
you are stealing my house.
It started in Sheikh Jarrah, where Israeli settlers forced Palestinian citizens out of their homes. Al-Aqsa Mosque, Islam's third holiest site, saw violence and bloodshed as Israeli forces went in and terrorized Muslims in the waning days of Ramadan. In Sheikh Jarrah, a Jewish district court ruled to displace families that have lived there for decades so Israeli settlers could take their land. The district court called them evictions, but they are simply anything but.
My Jewish values teach me to oppose apartheid.
To start, it's not really an eviction, it's forced ethnic displacement, to be accurate, because an eviction implies legal authority. While the Israeli occupation has no legitimate jurisdiction over the eastern parts of occupied Jerusalem under international law, it also implies the presence of a landlord, and certainly these Israeli settlers have not built our homes, they're not our landlords, they don't own our land. And thirdly, eviction does not imply the hundreds and hundreds of heavily armed police and army and settlers colluding, blowing up your doors, throwing your children from your windows, and using brute force to throw you out in the street and assaulting and arrest you should you resist.
We really are telling Palestinians fighting apartheid is the same thing being told to my black neighbors across the country that are fighting police brutality. There is no form of acceptable resistance to state violence, it seems. Accept the denial of humanity and dignity. Give up.
As we have seen, Manchester City's Riyad Mahrez wrote Save Sheikh Jarrah. His teammate Benjamin Mendy also posted his support for the refugee city. NBA champ Kyrie Irving, fasting during Ramadan, posted in support of Palestine on his IG, as did NBA All-Star Damian Lillard and his teammate Yusuf Nurkic, sharing a quote from another man who took on apartheid and is celebrated by many in the US, Nelson Mandela. Sheikh Jarrah has been discussed by many pro athletes. So what is happening?
And the US is calling for a de-escalation from all sides. Well, one of the reasons for the tensions, a battle over evictions in Jerusalem's Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood.
In short, way back when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, the British allowed Jewish immigration to the region. Zionism drove them there. They were oppressed. They believed this was, as Vox put in this piece, their only way to safety. Jewish people and Arabic people clashed, as well as Jews and the British. They formed their own militias and fought for the land. The UN drafted a proposal in 1947, what many would call the two-state system, leaving Jerusalem a special international zone. Thus, when Donald Trump and slumlord Jared Kushner recognized Jerusalem as the Israeli capital, it was controversial. Arabs did not approve of the UN's plan, seeing it as European colonialism. They declared war on Israel, lost, and Israel did not abide by the UN's plan. They kept pushing for more land. In 1967, they won another war, and as Vox alludes to, Israel had three choices on their neighbors. While the nation decided, Israelis just said F it and moved into their Arabic neighbors' land. The UN made it clear, Israel's establishment of settlements in Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem, had no legal validity, constituting a flagrant violation under international law. As they met, the UN demanded that Israel immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Of course, the United States, who's funding Israel and their police state, abstained in this vote. But hey, don't take my word for it. Take it from FAS.org's congressional research. The Israeli government saw the settlers as a huge W. They granted permits for building houses and roads while disproportionately favoring Israelis over Palestinians. Meanwhile, buildings constructed without an Israeli permit are regularly demolished by the military. As the years went on, it became more and more segregated. Just take a look at how the roads are designed to favor Israelis. There are two different license plates designated for Israelis and Palestinians to intentionally discriminate against one group of people. At the Oslo Accords, Israel and Palestine agreed to a three-zone system, but the problem that surfaced was the system catered to Israelis who created flyover roads, or roads that flew over Palestinian roads, making it easily accessible to get from one settlement to the next. Palestinians are not afforded that luxury. In all, Israelis moved into the West Bank to claim land so the Palestinians could have less. The displacement taking place rings hollow the days of Nakba, when in 1948 the war uprooted 700,000 Palestinians from their homes, creating a refugee crisis that is still not resolved. In Arabic, Nakba means catastrophe, and its legacy remains one of the most intractable issues in ongoing peace negotiations. Which brings us back to Jacob and the raw video of him stealing a Palestinian family's home. The United Nations called it a war crime, per Mehdi Hassan, citing the Geneva Conventions because, quote, the transfer of parts of an occupying Palestinian population into the territory it occupies is prohibited under international humanitarian law. B'Tselem, the leading Israeli human rights group, has called Israel an apartheid regime. A huge point. Human Rights Watch also did the same. It should be noted Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's prime minister, who has drawn similarities to white supremacist President Donald Trump, faces charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. Although he's denied any wrongdoing, some are pointing to these attacks as Netanyahu's way of revving up a base of support. His support has come from the extremist party Atzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power, whose leaders have a long history of expressing support for violence against Palestinians, expulsion of Arabs from Israel and the occupied territories, and a ban on intermarriage or sex between Jews and Arabs. He also turned to Michael Ben Ari and Itamar Ben-Gvir, co-founders of Lahava, a group that opposes Jewish-Arab relationships and was implicated in a 2014 arson attack on a school for Jewish and Arab children in Jerusalem. Mr. Ben-Gvir, who was a legislative aide for Mr. Ben Ari, has acknowledged having a picture in his home of Baruch Goldstein, the Kahan follower who massacred 29 Palestinians while they were praying at a mosque in Hebron in 1994. Now, some of you will say, what about Hamas? Let me be very clear on this. If you are a supporter of human rights, strictly human rights, like I am, no matter what side of the aisle you are on, violence is never the answer. Killing is never the answer. And that comes from both sides. With that being said, I do not support second-class citizenship and occupation/sieges.
Of course there's justification because of Jewish history for Israel. There's justification for Kurdistan because of Kurdish reality. There's justification for Pakistan. It's notable that Israel and Pakistan are both disasters. Israel not in the sense of, look, if you're a European Jewish background, you have a nice life there. If you're not, you are, even inside 67 borders, not a fully equal citizen. And the situation in the West Bank is, it is literally Jim Crow-like, and Gaza is, it's just an atrocity. So that's not something that anybody could reasonably ask me to support.